Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great? Good. I think it's fair to say that the SKS-45 is simultaneously one of the most beloved and disliked comm-block rifles. Its fans hail its rugged reliability, low price point, well, kind of these days, and that it's chambered in a common and still relatively inexpensive, well, not really that much these days, round, while its detractors argue that it's unreliable, inaccurate, and refer to it in glowing terms like garbage rifle and cockroach of the carbines. Like modern politics, not a lot of room in the middle. Now, I've long been debating in my head the following question. Was the SKS-45, despite its reasonably widespread use through the decades, actually an evolutionary failure that only remained alive because it was dumped on communist allies, poorer countries, and the military surplus market? Now, I'm not going to go into a deep dive on the developmental history of the SKS because I addressed a lot of that in a video I did last summer, debunking the common belief that it was used at the end of World War II. A belief, by the way, that Wikipedia still reports as fact. Wonderful. You can find a link to that video in the description below. Very simply, the SKS is a spiritual descendant of the PTRS-41 anti-tank rifle, both of which were designed by Sergei Semenov. You could argue that the PTRS tilting bolt design was in turn poached from the SVT-40, but I'll let firearms historians fight that battle. At any rate, from 1945 to 1958, the Soviet Union churned out about 2.7 million of the carbines, while other countries like Yugoslavia, China, Romania, Albania, among others, produced about another 13 million. Now, that's an impressive number for a rifle that was seemingly a stopgap between bolt-action rifles and the assault rifles that tended to replace it, usually the AK-47. But is it really, though? And does that amount of production alone make it a success? Let's look at the question of the rifle's alleged success from a few different perspectives, including longevity in service and whether the rifle's design influenced future firearms. First, let's look at usage and longevity in service. Now, this is actually a stronger hook for SKS proponents to hang their arguments on, but I would submit that even here the SKS was kind of a failure. Let's stipulate that a lot of countries used SKS rifles. If you look at a list of users on Wikipedia, for whatever that's worth, it's pretty impressive. It's made up of a lot of military powers like Cape Verde, the Seychelles, Moldova, Benin, Guyana, Congo, Sao Tome and Principe. Okay, I trust you get my point. I admit I'm being a little facetious, but although countries like the Soviet Union, China, Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Poland, and Romania, among others, use the rifle, the list of users isn't actually as impressive as you'd think. Nor was it as long-lived as you'd think, at least not in the way that people assume. Now, before we discuss longevity, I know that the rifle is still in use in several conflicts around the world, including Ukraine, Yemen, Myanmar, Syria. I'm reserving my comments strictly to countries that officially adopted it into service. There are people still using Martini Henrys in active combat today. It doesn't mean that we should consider that rifle to be in active service. So let's take a look at the Soviet Union. The rifle was formally introduced into service in 1949. The AK-47 was also officially adopted into service in 1949. Why did the SKS survive the introduction of the AK? Well, the Soviets had some big issues with early production of the AK rifle. The first models used stamped sheet metal receivers that had a milled trunnion and buttstock insert and a stamped body. They had problems welding the guide and ejector rails. It wasn't until 1951, when they moved to a milled receiver, that the issues were truly resolved. The moment that happened, the SKS was pretty much a second-line rifle. So we're really only looking at frontline service for a few years before it went to second-line units and, border units. Now, it did enjoy more success in China, but it seems no matter how much everyone says the rifle had a long life there, the Chinese military always seemed to be trying to replace it, either with the failed Type 63 and then with the AK clone dubbed the Type 56. Officially, the SKS, confusingly also the Type 56, did last decades in service, but the AK was the primary rifle. In Yugoslavia, although the M59/66, its version of the SKS-45, ostensibly served until 1991, its military adopted the M70, a clone of the AK-47, in 1970, which continues in use to today. The M59/66 wasn't considered the primary service rifle except for a few short years in the late 1960s. Now, I could keep going on and on with other Eastern European and Asian nations, but the story is generally the same. The moment capable countries could obtain the technical package for the AK-47, or at least reverse engineer it, the SKS-45 may have remained in some form of service, but Kalashnikov's baby became the primary arm. The rifle did see long-term service with smaller countries, the kind that buy or are given arms, but very few actually produced and used them for years. The second a viable alternative was available. Where the rifle did see extensive use were those groups that were allied to communist countries. Groups like the Viet Cong, Thai Communists, PFLO, PLO. Even with these groups, the SKS was either replaced quickly when AKs were available or relegated to second-line or irregular forces. In Vietnam, for example, the professional and VA generally got the AKs, where the SKSs were the province of the irregular Viet Cong, largely thanks to Chinese shipments from their stocks. Interesting fact, when the Chinese in Vietnam went to war in 1979, Chinese SKSs were on both sides of the conflict, meaning Chinese soldiers were being shot with the very carbines they had carried a few years earlier. Yeah, that's awkward. The reality is, the moment the AK-47 was introduced, rifles like the SKS-45 became obsolescent. Countries only stuck with semi-automatic rifles with limited magazine capacities because they had no choice, or in the case of countries like the United States and Canada, they suffered a catastrophic lack of clarity when it came to what was even then the obvious present of small arms, let alone the future. For me, the SKS is the historical equivalent of the tube magazine that several militaries' rifles used and became a dead end the second the box magazine was introduced. Tube magazines still work, but no one willingly chooses them when there's a better alternative. Now let's look at influence on other firearms. Folks, this is going to be a shorter section of the video for a very good reason. As a design, I argue that the SKS-45 was largely an evolutionary dead end. Now, I know that comparing the SKS-45 to the AK-47 is nonsensical. They are completely different rifles intended for different doctrines. The SKS was meant to be a standard small arm for soldiers to replace the M9130 and the SVT-40, while the AK was tactically a submachine gun. That said, these firearms served side by side in many countries for a number of years, and regardless of what the AK was meant to be doctrinally, it became a standard service rifle. That said, the AK-47 has influenced Soviet and Russian military rifle designs since it was introduced, whether it's the AK rifles or something like the RPK light machine guns. Virtually every Kalashnikov rifle since is a variation on a theme. Although the AK's influence outside of military arms is a bit more limited, you can still find a few civilian firearms, mostly Russian, that have poached significant design characteristics from the AK pattern of rifles. Further afield, the Kalashnikov system has influenced other rifles like the Finnish RK-62, South Africa's Vector R4, Hungary's AMD-65, Israel's Galil, Poland's FB Beryl, submachine guns including the PP-19 Bison, and DMRs like the Iraqi Tabuk and the Romanian PSL. Everything I've just named, plus others I haven't for the sake of brevity, all incorporate major elements of Mikhail Kalashnikov's design. The SKS Can you name a single rifle that's inspired by or based on the SKS-45? Now, I know some of you are out there are going to jump up and shout that the Chinese Type 81 has designed elements lifted from the SKS. Let's be honest, that rifle stole a lot more from AK-47s and Dragunovs than it did the SKS. But the only thing you can really say that the Type 81 borrowed from the SKS is its short-stroke gas system. Let's be honest though, that operating system wasn't unique to the SKS when China decided to steal yet another rifle design element. There was another Chinese rifle that sort of poached a bit from the SKS, and that was the Type 63 rifle. It was a short-lived small arm that tried to mold elements from both the AK platform and the SKS. It was also almost universally despised by every soldier that ever touched it. Outside of that, there's not much going for the SKS as an inspiration for other firearms. The day the SKS was introduced, it was essentially already obsolete. It was a rifle with an unremarkable, if reliable, operating system, though there are those who would take issue with claims of reliability, that was limited to semi-automatic fire and a small 10-round magazine. No one deliberately copied elements of the rifle to incorporate into their own designs. So why do a lot of military surplus collectors have what I would argue is an outsized view of the rifle's significance to firearms history? I think there's probably a few reasons. First, the rifle started flooding the markets back in the 1980s and 90s at prices so cheap you could buy one and not even miss the money. And let's remember that up until relatively recently, AK pattern rifles weren't really a thing in the US and haven't been a thing in Canada in decades. So if you wanted a comm block rifle that wasn't a Mosin Nagant M9130, the SKS was probably going to be your jam. So a lot of people's first and ongoing experience with a Soviet firearm was in fact the SKS. Next, I think the rifle's reliability deepens a lot of affection for it. For example, up here in Canada, our SHTF rifle isn't an AR-15, at least not anymore, thank you Justin Trudeau. It's the SKS, thanks to its perceived reliability, availability of ammunition, and up until recently, relatively low price. That, and we're not allowed to own AKs. In the US, while it'll never be hailed as a tack driver, I think people tend to share our assessment of the SKS's strengths. The ubiquity and how cheap it is to run is probably why so many firearms owners love the SKS-45. I'm not going to argue its merits or failings. I've owned a few of them over the years, and there are things about the carbine that I love, while other things I'm not a fan of. That said, I don't think I'm out of line referring to the SKS-45 as a historical failure, or, to be kind, the most successful failure in small arms history. At any rate, I hope you found today's video to be at least somewhat entertaining and vaguely informative. Agree or disagree? Feel free to argue it out in the comments section below. As always, I hope you have yourself a great day and get out there and shoot that SKS-45 you always pass over for another rifle when you go to the range. Take care and bye-bye.